Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Sanders with the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. Just going to welcome everyone to the webinar. First of all, just wanted to remind everyone you shouldn't be able to speak as an attendee in the webinar, but if you have any questions, go ahead and use the Q&A function as you see on your screen, or go ahead and send them to Jason Bush in the chat. We are recording this session, and we'll do our best to get it up on Poet's website as soon as we can. Usually takes a day or two to process and put it up there. So be sure to check back there. The slides will be available as well. And with that, I'm happy to pass it over to Jason. Go ahead and introduce the webinar.
Thank you, Matt. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to this fourth webinar in the Poet webinar series. We're very pleased today to be able to feature representatives of the Wind Energy Technology Office of the U.S. Department of Energy. Poet has worked with the Wind Energy Technology Office as well as the Water Power Technology Office, two separate offices underneath the heading of the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Program of the U.S. Department of Energy. Over the 10 years we've worked with these offices, we've always been very impressed with the level of knowledge and engagement, expertise, and really passion for our shared interest in renewable energy. So delighted to be able to feature these speakers today. Part of our intent here is to perhaps expose more people to the excellent work that the Wind Energy Technology Office does. It is an aspect of the DOE that they largely like to focus on research and development and technologies that might not be receiving commercial investment, in other words, benefiting from governmental investment in these technologies to help move them forward. So perhaps my selfish hope is that the floating offshore wind sector on the West Coast and of course elsewhere around the world would benefit from the focus of the Wind Energy Technology Office and help advance this amazing new technology and this opportunity for clean energy from the oceans. So I'm keeping my comments very short here today. Just a quick note about Poet. Poet is the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. We are a 501c3 organization with a mission to promote the responsible development of marine renewable energy. Many of you might be familiar with our previous iteration of our organization, which was called the Oregon Wave Energy Trust, OWET. About 5 years ago, we shut down OWET and reformed as Poet. And we continue to focus on all forms of marine renewable energy as an organization. Obviously, floating offshore wind has become increasingly relevant on the West Coast. We are also starting to focus more on decarbonization of the maritime sector in general. Perhaps a term that many have heard, the concept of the blue economy, is another area that Poet has begun to focus on. So with that, I will finish by saying that if you have ideas for future webinars that you'd like to see discussed, or perhaps help bring them together, or better yet, perhaps you'd like to sponsor one, we'd love to hear from you, so don't hesitate to reach out. As Matt mentioned, we are going to take questions today, and we're going to reserve those for the end. Feel free to post your questions under the Q&A button on the bottom. I will monitor those, collect them, and moderate a Q&A session at the very end of the presentations. So with that, I want to hand it over to Patrick Gilman. Patrick, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Jason, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to speak with you about the Wind Energy Technologies Office at DOE and the work that we are doing in floating and wind energy R&D in general and floating offshore wind in particular. I'm Patrick Gilman, as Jason introduced. I'm the Modeling and Analysis Program Manager for the Wind Energy Technologies Office. Been in the office for a dozen years now, so about to go through another administration transition. My role with the office is to help us evaluate technology R&D opportunities, to track the status of wind energy technologies in the market, and to think about and do analysis on what wind's role might be in our energy future. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what we do in the Wind Office, and then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Dan Beals, who is a contractor supporting us, who's been supporting us for about 4 years in our offshore wind technology, to talk about our R&D efforts specific to offshore wind. So just to kick it off, I thought I'd go through a couple of maps that kind of get at the context for some of the work that we're doing. So this is a map of U.S. wind resources at 100 meters above surface level, produced by NREL. And as you can see here, there's the darker blues indicate stronger wind speeds. There's a really tremendous opportunity for wind in the United States. And that is not just in the wind belt, where we've got a lot of wind deployed already, but also on the coasts. And particularly if you're looking on the Atlantic, north of North Carolina, and on the Pacific coast, particularly in California, those really dark blue patches off of Northern California and Oregon. There's a huge opportunity here. Offshore wind resource in the United States is roughly 2 terawatts, which is about twice the installed capacity of electricity in the US. And 60% of that is in deep water, meaning it needs floating technologies. The second I'd like to put up there is that we've made a lot of progress in accessing this opportunity. And a lot of that is due to, there's policy drivers for that, obviously, but a lot of that is also due to technological progress. We've been able to get wind energy to the point where costs and the average installed cost or levelized cost of wind energy in the United States is now below 4 cents per kilowatt hour. That was almost unimaginable. It was actually our 2030 goal when I first started at DOE in 2008, which gives you a sense of how quickly the costs have come down. There's almost 110 gigawatts installed in the US, and that represents 7% of total US electricity. And wind is now the largest source of renewable generation in the United States, just passing hydropower this past year. And those are major, major accomplishments. But we have a long way left to go. This map is from the U.S. Wind Turbine Database, and there's obviously lots of wind projects that pop up in the middle of the country and in various places on land. There are 2 wind projects installed offshore in the United States now. One, Block Island in Rhode Island, 30 megawatts, was installed in 2016, and one that literally just started sending electrons to the grid, a 2-turbine, 12-megawatt project off of the coast of Virginia. So we've really just barely begun scratching the surface on this offshore wind opportunity that we have. There's a lot of interest, policy drivers, policies, and particularly at the state level, on the Atlantic coast have driven a lot of interest. There's a lot of leasing activity that BOEM's done that a lot of you will know about. There's 28 gigawatts currently in the U.S. offshore wind pipeline. Some of that is floating, but floating technologies are still really in a nascent stage of development, mostly kind of early commercial around the world. And so there's a ways yet to go. And that gets at kind of the key challenges that we think about when we're looking at wind generally, but also in offshore and floating offshore wind in particular. The unsubsidized cost of these technologies in some applications, like floating offshore wind, are still high. If you were to bid in a floating offshore wind project in an all-source RFP for a PPA in the United States without subsidies or policy mandates, it would be really difficult to compete on a cost basis alone. And so there's a lot of work that we can do to reduce the costs, particularly in floating offshore wind. There's some significant technical challenges also remaining, which is not to say that the technology is not possible. I mean, we've seen it demonstrated, and there are sort of small commercial arrays that are beginning to be installed in Europe for floating offshore wind. But there's a lot of technical challenges that remain if we want to get the cost down low enough that it can be competitive on an unsubsidized basis in the U.S. There's also a lot of challenges associated with environmental inciting. We don't know how floating offshore wind will interact with the various other users of the ocean and environmental resources, marine mammals, birds, other wildlife, and other siting constraints like radar, DoD uses of the ocean, and all of those things need to be worked through. And finally, as folks in California will know, our grid was not developed with offshore wind or floating offshore wind in mind. And so we've got a lot of work to do to understand, one, the impact of integrating lots of offshore wind into the system, and two, to figure out how we can inform the planning of an electricity system that allows these resources to access the grid. So those are key roles. We have a key role to play in that through our work funding innovation and R&D. Our R&D are really focused on driving down cost and driving reduction to barriers to deployment. And over time, as you can see from the graph on the right, which is in blue, and in the yellow dots, you see LCOE, levelized cost of energy, coming down significantly over the last few decades, and installed wind capacity really jumping. And we've had a lot of success in technology development, and I think a significant role that we played. And DOE program demonstrated the first megawatt scale machines in the United States that really helped wind break out of its early market in California to become much more widespread. A lot of the kind of aerodynamic innovations of wind rotors come out of the DOE program that have allowed wind turbines really to grow beyond what people thought was possible back in the early days of wind technology. We've been really instrumental, I think, in helping to make some real advances in understanding of the flow of the wind, the fuel of a wind plant, so that we can better design technology to interact with that resource. And then I think something that folks might not think about as a traditional technology R&D role, but we've done a lot of work to better understand the environmental impacts of wind and to develop mitigation technologies associated with that have helped wind to deploy and reduce its environmental footprint. A lot of this, again, comes back to cost, and so I'll just highlight the cost reduction goals down there in the lower left. By 2030, we have a goal to help land-based wind reach 2 cents a kilowatt hour in the United States. Fixed bottom offshore wind, is being deployed out now in the Atlantic, to about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And then the big challenge for us, I think, and an exciting one, getting floating offshore wind down to around the same level, to say 6 cents by 2030. To do that, our program is divided up into a number of areas, which my colleagues will be speaking about today. Our program is broken up into land-based distributed wind, so smaller systems and smaller applications, and then offshore wind, which we'll be focusing on here today. We have a program in systems integration, which deals with how wind energy technologies integrate with other resources on the electricity system. And then we have a program in modeling and analysis to assess R&D opportunities that I'll be talking about a little bit. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dan Beals to introduce himself and talk about our offshore wind technology portfolio. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Appreciate it. So yeah, as Patrick mentioned, my name is Daniel Beals. I work for Allegheny Science and Technology. We're a contractor to the U.S. Department of Energy. I've been working in the wind program now for about 8 years, but have been supporting the offshore wind portfolio, as well as the analysis portfolio for around 4 years now. So I work specifically on our 2 offshore wind demonstration projects. We have a project in Maine, as well as one off the coast of Lake Erie off the coast of Ohio. And I also work with Patrick on some of the other techno-economic reporting of our cost targets for the program. But really here, I want to talk about some of the R&D challenges as we see them within the broader wind energy portfolio, and where we think we can have the most impact. So the first is atmospheric science. We're working to improve our understanding of physics, of the physics of atmospheric flow. We know that improving stability and managing turbulence at hub height is essential to designing the next generation of larger wind turbines and achieving the dynamic control of these machines. Another one is wind plant aerodynamics. We're trying to improve our understanding of complex flow physics and wake flow dynamics, which drive plant performance. So one key thing to mention here is that, turbine wakes reduce plant performance and they increase operations and maintenance costs and, can reduce the plant life of these machines. So, and they're not really well understood. So we're working to make improvements that will enable integrated active plant controls and optimize turbine and plant designs. And then technology development, which I'll go into a bit further in detail later on, but I just want to talk through some of the primary areas that we're focused on. We're working to develop design tools and realistic plant models. We're funding materials and manufacturing research, and we're collecting real-world data from WETO-owned buoys, just like the two that are currently located off the coast of California. And then finally, as Patrick mentioned, grid integration and siting and environmental impacts, those will be covered by our colleagues later on. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. And what I really want to do here is kind of set the stage. So, I want to kind of visualize a scenario because this is going to be vital for our understanding and our ability to perform this research and development for the next generation. We're really focused on that 3 to 5 to 7. We have to scale the next generation of these machines that will be deployed. So, the current and projected future floating systems are huge. The current largest announced turbine is 14 megawatts. We don't really see significant reasons why they won't scale up further. So I want to stretch a bit and imagine this notional 20 megawatt floater. The challenges of design, fabrication, installation, operations, maintenance, they all become clearer when you start to look at something this large. Imagine each blade is as long as a soccer field. The tower could weigh as much as 800 metric tons. And in this specific example, we're imagining the rotor and the cell assembly weighing upwards of 1,000 metric tons. So these are huge machines, and it really puts things into perspective. So equipment this large will incentivize, fabrication and installation concepts that can rely on port infrastructure and be floated out to project sites. And additionally, these efforts making components lightweight have positive ripple benefits throughout the system in terms of reducing mass for cables and mooring lines, as well as other mass throughout the system. And so I mentioned, the foundation for these need to be able to support these tall towers and large turbines, and they need to be stable enough to support operation in a variety of significant sea and wind conditions. But it still needs to be cheap enough to build serially and cost competitive other energy sources. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about moorings and anchors that hold the floater and need to be strong. They need to hold the turbine during normal operations, but also during extreme weather and, hurricanes, et cetera. And, they have to last upwards of 30 years. So there are a lot of physics coming into this. But really, the point I'm trying to make here is that these challenges aren't new. We've seen a lot of activities in the oil and gas industry and have been tackling challenges for decades, with the main difference being that these offshore wind turbines need to be serially produced, as well as really cheap to be cost effective with other generating technologies. So moving on to the next slide, I just want to talk quickly about some of the floating offshore wind technology development. To address these challenges, we fund a number of different entities. We work with national laboratories, academic institutions, consortia, NGOs, small businesses, and other companies within the industry. And so just to look a little bit deeper into some of the work we're funding, we fund high fidelity modeling supported by high performance computing, which can incorporate more physics, providing faster capabilities. And that knowledge can then be used to conduct virtual experiments, leading to a better understanding of what physics are important for tool designs. So we fund projects such as A2E, wind measurement model development, as well as test facilities and design tools. And then specifically for design tools, they aren't currently adequate enough to capture the physics and dynamics of single turbines, never mind the dynamic interactions between turbines across multiple plants. So, we're investing in computers that are able to faster, more sophisticated model these things, and in particular, the coupling of floating foundations and hydrodynamic response with turbine air elastic behavior. And as I mentioned, as turbines continue to scale, these are the largest flexible structures in the world. So those new materials, design methods, manufacturing, logistics are all things that we're currently looking at. And then, finally on this, I just kind of want to touch on controls, because controls are really critical here. Since these platforms are moving, we need to control these systems, and we have to have systems that can consider both wind and platform motions. And the goal here is to maximize power output, but minimize equipment wear and tear, and as well as mitigate wake effects on downstream turbines. So really, we have three significant opportunities here: reduce mass and enable scaling. We think we can improve performance through flow manipulation, and finally, reduce financing and grid integration costs by improving performance prediction. Okay, and then finally, on my final slide here, I just wanted to show some of the anchor and mooring work that we're funding. Obviously, for floating offshore wind, moorings and anchors are critical to both the physics of floating offshore wind farms, but also for siting and permitting reasons. So really the goal here is to show you that there's a large array of concepts out there. And we're funding the analysis of a number of these anchors and moorings to create a toolbox approach to satisfy the demands of different technologies and diverse regions. And I'm happy to talk about some of these, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it there and then send it back to Patrick.
Thanks, Dan. So I'll talk a little bit about our analysis and modeling work. Dan walked through a number of the R&D challenges and opportunities that we see in floating offshore wind. We need a robust way to be able to evaluate those kinds of opportunities, and that's where the analysis and modeling work that I lead comes in. The idea here really is to identify the most promising technology improvements to figure out how those might impact wind in the future electricity sector. And obviously we need a lot of robust empirical data around what wind technology is doing now in order to accomplish that. We do a lot of analyses like you see on the right here, where we're looking at how different innovations might impact cost, and then sort of scenario analysis looking at the future and how those cost reductions and innovations might translate into wind deployment in different scenarios. And just a real quick dive into what we do on the offshore side that Matt Shields from NREL is going to get to in more depth in a minute. First, one sort of flagship product that you may be familiar with, our offshore wind technology data update, just released by NREL. There's a link in the presentation, so when the POET folks post it, the materials, you should be able to click on that. And if not, if that doesn't work, I'm happy to send a link around. That tracks wind technology or floating and fixed bottom offshore wind technology globally. It helps us really understand what technology is doing, what costs look like now, to identify those R&D opportunities going forward. We're also very much now, especially with respect to floating offshore wind, in capability development mode. we need to have the tools in place to really evaluate the impact of different technology innovations on all parts of the offshore wind system. So we're investing significantly particularly at the National Renewable Energy Lab, in a suite of models and tools that'll all be open source, so all available to the research community more broadly, to help us look at how different changes to, say, offshore wind installation methods or turbine technology or platforms might impact the full cost of the system. And with that, I am going to introduce Matt Shields. Matt's a senior research engineer supporting offshore wind in the National Renewable Energy Lab, and he's going to speak to some of the work that they're doing on offshore wind analysis. Matt, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I'm just pulling up some slides here, so let me know if there's any difficulty seeing my screen. I'm being told by Zoom that should be available now. Yeah, hi everyone. This is Matt Shields, and yeah, thanks very much again for the introduction, Patrick. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I'm the PI for the Wind Plant Technology Characterization Project, which falls within Patrick's modeling and analysis portfolio. And I'm going to take time today to talk a little bit about some of the techno-economic analysis that we do at NREL. So that part of that will involve describing our role within the DOE portfolio. Certainly this will not be an exhaustive list of all of the floating offshore wind work that NREL does. And I'd also like to just talk a little bit about some of the ongoing tool development that Patrick has just referenced, and suggest how some of these models are used in different types of analysis projects moving forward. So the Wind Plant Technology Characterization Project is an annually recurring project funded by DOE that's conducted at NREL. And the main goals of this project are to analyze historical cost trends, report benchmark cost data to the wind industry, identify meaningful cost reduction pathways for both fixed bottom and floating offshore wind, and also developing these open source modeling tools that can be used by the entire community for various analysis projects. Just as some context, if we look at this is actually a figure from the slide deck that Patrick's just referenced from the offshore wind data update. But if we look at global projections of floating offshore wind, we see cost ranges which have quite a bit of scatter to them, to be honest, but are at the moment still fairly high relative to fixed bottom offshore wind, let alone onshore or conventional generation sources. The trend is certainly moving in the right direction, as analysts worldwide expect that floating offshore wind projects' cost will decrease quite significantly over the next decade. However, this uncertainty really exists, which we'd like to have a better understanding and characterization of, as well as identifying what R&D opportunities can be used to realize these cost reductions, or potentially even push them a little bit further towards lower costs. So at NREL, we do quite a bit of floating wind cost modeling, and the goal here of what we try to do in the techno-economic portfolio is to develop these models that can estimate costs, but couple them quite closely with the scientific and engineering work which is being done at NREL, so that we can understand the most up-to-date technology solutions and understand the impact on costs. So I'd like to give a quick summary of a couple of our sort of flagship cost models that we use for our major analyses. And these have all been developed with the funding and support and collaboration of the Wind Energy Technology Office. The first one I would discuss is a model we refer to as ORCA, which is the Offshore Regional Cost Analyzer. And the goal of this model is to look at spatial and temporal variations of cost. So rather than really looking at an individual project, we want to know, how do costs vary over a region, and how do we expect those costs to vary over time as additional innovations become available, or additional experience or learning within the supply chain or in the project installation spheres can be realized. This model employs a series of bottom-up models, including installation methods, cable configuration, capital costs, and energy production, as well as being coupled to state-of-the-art wind resource data and AEP, or annual energy production estimation. So a parallel project, which I don't have discussed in the slides today, has, for example, just developed a new wind resource data set for the California, Oregon, and Washington coasts. This model directly calls from the new wind resource data set in order to calculate energy production for each particular point in this grid. The model also selects the lowest cost substructure at each site with selections of both fixed bottom and floating different topologies. It computes costs in the present year and then projects these costs into the future, as I think you can see in the bottom right figure here, where we can see a projection of both fixed and floating costs for the entire U.S. resource area. And what's nice about this is it's actually a model with low computational expense. So it's easy to run quick and dirty sensitivity analyses to see the impact of a particular technology or innovation. Like all of our models, we continuously update and expand and review this model with industry to reflect the rapidly changing offshore wind industry. This model has been used as the basis for a few high-impact flagship papers. There's been a National Offshore Wind Strategy report, as well as cost analyses, which featured the ORCA model, as well as more specific cost analyses for specific states. So this is a model that we can use to look at kind of these big regional questions of, where are the best areas to target and develop floating offshore wind on the Pacific coast, for example, or off the coast of Hawaii. A more project-specific model, which is a more recent development at the lab, is one that we refer to as Orbit, the Offshore Renewables Balance of System and Installation Tool. This project takes a deeper dive into the individual project logistics. So it simulates the installation process of a particular offshore wind project, again, either fixed bottom or floating, on an hourly timescale to look at where are the constraints, where are the bottlenecks, where are the risks of delays, what's the impact of waiting on weather windows, and how can that be mitigated with different technologies or different strategies. It also includes sizing tools, so substructures, cables, moorings, anchors, and so forth are scaled as you change the turbine rating or as you change the project location, for example. So you can look at how these cost trends change from site to site, but you get a bit more granularity than you do with the ORCA model. We like using this model to look at kind of the more specific questions about project cost and risk, and how individual process or technology innovations can be incorporated into that model, quite a flexible model, in order to alleviate some of those concerns or cost adders. So this is a pretty recent model. This was developed over about the last year and a half with support and collaboration from the Wind Energy Technology Office. It's been publicly available since, well, I guess since December of last year is when the fixed bottom version was released, and that was expanded to include floating capabilities in June of this year. And that's currently in use for a number of sensitivity studies. For instance, looking at the impact of increased turbine rating on the impact on cost categories. So as you increase the turbine rating for a given plant size, you need fewer substructures, less cable, lower installation costs, and so forth. And we're actually able to quantify those impacts with this model. In addition to these kind of active models that we're using at the moment, we also have a few additional tools which are under development. Just as a quick mention here, there's an operations and maintenance model, which follows the same process-based simulation framework as Orbit and allows you to vary installation strategies or methodologies and evaluate the impact on project cost and performance. we're developing a new cost projection model, which we call the FORCE model, for forecasting offshore wind reductions in the cost of energy. And this couples some of our bottom-up models along with an empirical learning curve approach to project future costs for fixed bottom and floating offshore wind. And then just another reference to the offshore wind technology updates, which Patrick already mentioned, that NREL reports annually with a focus on the US market, but also an eye towards the global market overall to see how do cost, technologies, pipeline definitions, so basically the number of proposed projects change annually. I'm running a bit low on time, so I'll just quickly summarize how a few ways that these models are implemented for some specific projects. So an upcoming project this year within the wind plant technology characterization project, again, something that has been sort of developed in collaboration with the Department of Energy team, is a comprehensive study of floating wind project installation logistics with a focus on the west coast of the US. So this will be using Orbit to systematically look at the constraints, bottlenecks, risks, uncertainties associated with installing commercial scale floating wind projects given the existing infrastructure on the west coast. So those are the ports, the vessels, the cranes, the weather, and the mid-ocean conditions that we expect these projects to see once they're actually being deployed. The model work will be coupled with a survey of several industry practitioners to refine and understand the pain points that developers are thinking of right now. What's keeping them up at night when they're worrying about how to actually install a project? And again, we'll be looking at how to mitigate some of these risks with technologies or process innovations. And this leads back into the Department of Energy goal to again, identify the most meaningful cost reduction pathways for floating offshore wind. The last thing I'll mention, this is my last slide, is that we also use these tools which are developed usually within the DOE umbrella, but to partner with non-DOE collaborators. So a couple of recent examples have been cost assessments that we've done for floating wind off the coast of California and Oregon for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. You can see a figure on the right here showing LCOE heat maps off the coast of California for floating wind projects installed in 2019 versus 2032. We have an upcoming project to do something similar for Hawaii. And this is something that we use the ORCA model for with some input and coupling to the individual orbit model as well. And then a link back to the myriad of projects that Dan described in the previous slide deck, particularly some of the ones funded through the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium and partnerships with developers such as Principal Power or academic institutions such as the University of Massachusetts to look into mooring systems, shared mooring lines, novel materials, and evaluate the cost impact of those innovations through the Orbit model. So again, while these tools are developed primarily with support from DOE, we do want these to be open source models used by the community and really capable of answering a wide range of research questions. With that being said, I'll thank both Jason and Poet for the invitation to be here, and Patrick and Dan for the introduction. Please feel free to contact me. My email address is on the slide here, and I'm happy to answer any questions either in the Q&A session today or at a later date. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Matt. And just a note for everyone on the webinar, you can see here that the idea is we're talking about the high-level DOE research strategy in these different areas, and then trying to give you a flavor with presentation by an individual PI working on part of that work. And so the structure of the webinar going forward will be the same. Next, we're going to turn over to Jocelyn Brown-Saraceno and Jian Fu from our office, who will be speaking to our environmental siting, workforce development, and grid portfolios. First, to introduce Jocelyn, she's the program manager for wind energy, environmental siting, and workforce development. She's worked with the Wind Office for the past decade and has managed a variety of work aimed at addressing wind siting and deployment challenges nationwide, particularly, and has been a real leader in particularly in the environmental space and in developing better understanding the impacts of wind development on different resources, as well as developing mitigation technologies to address those. And then Jian Fu is the systems integration lead for our office. In that role, Dr. Fu works closely with other DOE offices and national laboratories to improve how wind energy interacts with the grid. She's been with DOE for 4 years, coming to us from a career in private industry with, among other companies, Alstom, and she holds a PhD from Iowa State. So I'll turn it over to Jocelyn, and she and Jen will tag team this next presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick. Jason and Matt, thanks so much for the opportunity to speak today, and thanks to you all for taking the time to join us. So as Patrick mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the work that we support around addressing environmental siting and workforce development challenges associated with offshore wind development in the United States. The way that we organize our work within our portfolio is that we support a variety of research aimed at addressing siting, environmental, and radar interference challenges associated with offshore wind development, as well as supporting a suite of efforts to really ensure that we have a robust future offshore wind workforce with a range of activities from national needs and gaps analyses to really trying to convene the offshore wind industry, educational institutions in our national labs to identify ways to fill future potential gaps, and working to catalyze STEM and workforce development programming for offshore and land-based wind. So I'm going to be talking briefly about our work in each of these areas in the coming slides. So within our environmental research portfolio, we work both across land-based wind and offshore wind to really work to develop informed technical solutions to wildlife impacts. Kind of our logic flow with respect to how we get there with offshore wind, and in this context, floating offshore wind, is that first we really need to we're in a place right now where there are some questions regarding both the type and magnitude of impacts in US waters, simply because we have seen very little offshore wind development in the United States to date, and no floating offshore wind development on the West Coast yet. And so to help us get to the place where we have a good understanding of what those impacts are and where needed we have mitigation solutions, we think that we both need to work through an engagement process to help us prioritize research needs in light of conversations with stakeholders, but also really applying lessons learned from global research on offshore wind technologies writ large, but also on research on floating systems in particular. For some questions, we still need to work to advance the technology readiness of monitoring tools to really allow us to ask and answer those questions. And then, apply those tools to help addressing kind of the highest priority knowledge and research gaps to reduce uncertainty with respect to impacts. And if and when impacts are shown to be significant, use that information to really help us develop informed mitigation solutions. And where they're not, work to retire risk by determining the impacts are not likely to cause significant harm, and ensuring that we have active predictive models that allow us to predict those impacts at the outset. And we think that through these efforts, we really come to a place where we see reduced environmental impact reduce uncertainty around project deployment and risk, and increase access to wind resources. And right now, our portfolio is really aimed at kind of these first couple boxes that you see here in light blue, really helping prioritize research needs through engagement and synthesis of global research outcomes and developing monitoring tools. So a few examples of the work that we're doing in this space. With respect to working collaboratively to synthesize what we understand internationally about environmental impacts of offshore wind, DOE leads in conjunction, we support, and in conjunction with our national labs, leads an IEA, an International Energy Agency task called REN, where member nations from over a dozen countries come together to share information with respect to environmental research on offshore wind and land-based wind, and then work together to try to identify common solutions. We also support the hosting of the TETHIS database, which is a database that houses, among other, a suite of resources around offshore wind environmental research. And then also provides a literature library on research from around the world. And I believe that the offshore wind SEER project was the focus of a previous webinar, so I won't talk about this in too much depth, but we are working to support efforts through two of our national labs to both create synthesis short science summaries around the status of what we understand about the environmental impacts of offshore wind, and then work to help convene stakeholders around research needs and priorities, questions around research needs and priorities. And then finally, we released a request for information this last spring or early summer around research needs with respect to environmental impacts of offshore wind. And we got some really thoughtful responses from stakeholders on the West Coast and are actively working to think through what that means for us in terms of what comes next from a research perspective in this space. We're also working to develop a suite of monitoring tools. Just to mention a couple, we're working to develop automated collision, a couple different approaches to automated collision monitoring systems to allow us to monitor bird and bat impacts with offshore wind systems in real time, as well as 3D real-time bird and bat tracking thermal camera system. I believe Sherry Matzner had an opportunity to speak about this work on a previous webinar as well. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, we are also working to identify solutions to interference posed by the movement of turbine blades with radar systems. DOE, in conjunction with our Sandia National Lab, facilitates a working group of other federal agencies, really working to both better evaluate and understand the impacts of wind energy on radar systems, work to develop mitigation solutions for the suite of existing radar, and then also to encourage solutions, the development of solutions to next generation radar systems so that when we deploy next generation radars, they're more resilient to wind turbine interference. And we have a growing focus on offshore wind within that group. And just a quick note, if there are any other speakers who are still on audio, if you'd be willing to mute your microphones, that would be great. I think we're getting just a little bit of feedback. So moving on to efforts that we have in place to really make sure that fact-based neutral information with respect to wind energy deployment, including offshore wind development, is available to stakeholders. DOE supports a platform called Wind Exchange, which has a body of resources on offshore wind energy development. And one resource in particular that you can find there that that was developed in conjunction with our National Renewable Energy Laboratory is an overview webinar of floating offshore wind that's been very popular since it was published earlier this spring. And then finally, I'll just mention that we are working to really try to better understand future offshore wind workforce needs, as well as develop programming to help address, make sure that we have a robust offshore wind workforce in the future. So a couple examples of programming that we're doing in this space, we're helping support the establishment of WindU, which is a consortium of universities looking to share course opportunities at a graduate level for wind energy education, including some offshore wind coursework. And that was developed in conjunction with the National Wind Energy Academy. We're also working to develop, we host a collegiate wind competition that challenges university students to develop turbine designs and test them. And we're working to develop future competitions with an increased offshore wind focus. And we even have our newest tunnels have the capability of testing floating offshore wind design. So looking to increase the representation of offshore wind and floating offshore wind education needs in our workforce programming moving forward. And with that, thanks again for your time. I'll pass the virtual microphone over to Jian Fu, who will be speaking about our efforts around offshore wind grid integration. And Jian, if you're speaking, I think you may be on mute still.
Yeah, I'm trying to share my application.
I got it.
Somehow I lost the application now. Let me see. Okay, let's redo that. Sorry, guys. Just give me a couple more minutes, couple of seconds. There you go. Found it. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jian Fu, program lead for system integration at Wind Office. Before I start, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and thank Poet for the opportunity to share with you our work in this space. Wind Office system integration program addresses wind integration challenges for utility scale, offshore wind, and land-based wind. Our R&D investment in this area started roughly 25 years ago, when integrating less than 1% of wind for utility was a challenge. The wind integration started to take off around the turn of the century. We are proud that today wind is #1 renewable resource in US, and it's contributing more than 7% of electricity in the United States. Region numbers vary. Southwest Power Pool and the Texas ERCOT lead the top 2 records for independent system operators. They each have 27% and 22% of wind share in 2019, and as high as 73% and 59% of instantaneous wind penetration in spring this year. Our key projects, R&D projects over the past 10 years are summarized onto this slide. They cover a wide range of topics from integration studies, active power controls, utilization of transmission infrastructure, wind forecast, and analytics for grid operation, and more. For example, the top row shows our large-scale wind integration studies, started from Western Interconnection Study to National Offshore Wind Integration Study to East Interconnection Study, and we are currently wrapping up the North American Renewable Integration Study. The published results of those studies have boosted industry's confidence to planning and operating growing amount of wind in their systems. Wind grew from a marginal energy resource to a mainstream one in the past decade. Looking forward, significant challenges remain. In the coming years, as the cost of wind is expected to decrease, the deployment of wind is likely to grow. Energy system itself is also rapidly changing. The program will continue to invest in R&D to ensure cost-effective, cyber-secure, reliable, and resilient system operation with higher levels of wind. When talking about wind integration for the future, we have to think about what the energy system of the future look like. There are many different pathways and very different characteristics of the future energy system. Here, we just try to give you some examples. First, the continued technology innovation will drive the cost reduction. It is anticipated that a resource mix will continue to evolve and with likely to have increased deployment of solar and wind and energy storages. The future grid will be more distributed and decentralized with growing distributed energy resources and the way to manage millions of those small resources. The load profile in the future will be quite different from what we see today with the increase of responsive load and the electrification of other sectors such as transportation and the building sector. Just as we are experiencing the global pandemics, there are the increasing extreme weather events and potential adversary threats demand more grid reliability and resilience. We identified 5 key challenges for wind to work with the other grid components to be an integral part of the future energy systems. Those challenges are listed here, and I will go over them one by one and add some offshore wind specific challenges. The first challenge is the growing flexibility needs. For a system with increasing share of weather-dependent resources, flexibility that used to be provided by conventional generators may not be sufficient in the near future. Take a look at the California duck curve in the upper right figure. There is a very steep ramping needs during sunset to keep the lights on. The greater demands for flexibility should not just come from conventional generators, but other resources like wind and solar themselves in combination with standalone battery storage or hybrid battery storage could also help. Last November, with a collaboration between Avangrid, GE, California, ISO, and the National Renewable Energy Lab, we successfully demonstrated that wind can follow dispatch signals from grid operator and provide ramping services among several other essential reliability services at Avangrid's Tule wind plant near San Diego, California. Although the demonstration was for a land-based wind, offshore wind will have similar capability. Offshore wind has its unique characteristics such as close to the load center, large capacity factors, but we believe that their capabilities is similar, if not more, to provide flexibility services to the grid. The second key challenge is grid stability and resilience concerns with growing large amount of inverter-based resources. The colorful figures in the right-hand side shows the hourly wind and solar penetration in West Electric Council. WEC covers pretty much the whole Western interconnection. The top one is the 2019 number, and the bottom one represents a perceived 2028 number using WEC's published data set. The color represents the relative ratio of solar and wind in this hour. The bottom, the x-axis shows the relative penetration level, solar and wind combined to the load, and the y-axis shows the total generation of the system. In 2019 figure, it seems that the highest penetration of wind and solar is slightly over 30%. Comparing the two figures, there is a clear trend that the total wind and solar penetration will increase, and the wedge shape will move further to the right and move upwards. In 2028, it seems there will be a lot more hours that wind and solar will reach higher than 40% and even 50% for the whole West interconnection. This is very significant. Depending on the geographic locations, some region may have much higher local penetration of wind and solar. Wind and solar are inverter-based resources. Unlike synchronous generators, they interface with the grid through power electronics. At those moments with high penetrations of inverter-based resources, the grid is weak with fewer synchronous generators. it is vulnerable to contingencies that may lead to system instability and even power outages. Wind Office is currently funding projects to study how wind can be controlled to stabilize the grid in a similar way or even better than a synchronous generator, and could even provide black start services during system restoration. This research, although started with focusing on land-based wind, it can be extendable to the offshore wind. In the meantime, for floating offshore, it is likely to have HVDC export cables to connect to onshore grid. The interactions of HVDC lines, its converter stations, and the wind converters could also impact the grid stability. Our next speaker from NREL will provide some technical deep dive into this topic. The next challenge is transmission adequacy. Good wind resources on land are usually remote from load centers. Transmission upgrades are sometimes needed for interconnection of new wind plant. Otherwise, wind will be curtailed for system reliability. This is probably more critical for offshore wind at this moment. Offshore wind is relatively close to load center, but in northeast coastal area, you probably have heard it already, 28 gigawatt of offshore wind is in the pipeline, and they are expected to be in operation in 15 years. It will be a challenge for the grid over that area to absorb those size of wind energy. Questions like whether, when, how to plan for offshore transmission expansion, and to plan for onshore transmission expansion, and offshore transmission options have invoked many discussions recently. In fact, FERC just had a technical conference on this topic 2 days ago. West Coast are facing similar issues with very limited grid capability to absorb offshore wind in certain areas. The previous transmission first models, such as Texas CRESS and California's Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project, have proved the benefits of transmission for renewable integration. There may be other models for transmission expansion that worth exploring. On the other hand, transmission expansion takes years to build. Wind Office is actively seeking solutions to reduce transmission congestion and mitigate wind curtailment through various promising grid enhancing technologies. In the meantime, we are also looking for ways to utilize an otherwise curtailed wind. Next is on the market impact. The graph shows the historical negative price at ISOs. There is a correlation between the increased wind and solar penetration and the frequency of negative price. There are multiple reasons behind the negative price. Regardless, it does not set the right signal to those who want to invest in generation for the future. We are currently funding a technical assistance project to ISO RTU and its stakeholders to help them provide some support to help them find some solutions to their mid to long-term challenges. Last but not least, cybersecurity. For a large wind plant, no matter it's onshore, offshore, land-based and offshore, hundreds of wind turbines are connected, communicated, and controlled. As wind is a mainstream generation resource, a successful attack to a wind site could lead to the spread of attack to other interconnected grid components and could potentially lead to substantial consequences. Our cyber R&D will follow the NIST framework, and the goal is for future wind energy system to be designed and retrofitted so that they are resilient to cyber attacks. Wind Office recently identified 5 R&D priorities to address wind integration challenges for land-based and offshore wind. From bottom up, there are wind physical and cyber security, wind hardware and control, wind hybrid system, system planning and market impact, and last, the reliability and resilient system operation. The text box provides some offshore-specific research topics that the priorities should address. They are definitely not exhaustive. In mind of time, I will just give you one example. For the hardware and control of offshore wind, we will focus our work on offshore wind plant controls to provide a wide range of grid services. From the hardware side, we are interested in innovative floating technologies such as dynamic cables, floating or submersible substations, HVDC, and power electronics for further reduce the cost of offshore electrical components. With that, I'll end my presentation, and I'll look forward to the Q&A session. And our next speaker will come from NREL, and they will share us more about HVDC and offshore wind transmission. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jen. And at this point, we'll turn it over to Dr. Shahil Shah and Dr. Vahan Gevorgian, both from NREL. They focus on the control, modeling, and stability of power systems with a focus particularly on how we manage power systems with high penetrations of renewable energy. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Shah and Dr. Gevorgian.
Hi, can you guys see my screen? Yeah. Hi,
Yep.
My name is Vahan Gevorgian. I'm a chief engineer for at NREL for grid integration, presenting the joint work that we do with my colleague Shahil Shah, who is also online, and we can jump in anytime to help answering questions if there is any. So before starting, we'd like to thank both collate and DOE for inviting us to be here. Jan, thank you so much for your staging the talk about grid integration challenges. So we'll try to provide a deeper dive on what stability challenges are out there for offshore wind. So as Jan mentioned, grid reliability and stability issues for offshore wind in a way are not different like for any onshore variable generation on onshore wind, but with addition of specifics of offshore operations such as use of much larger wind turbines, much larger wind power plants that are injecting variable power directly in often congested load centers on the coast through subsea transmission that can be based on either high voltage AC or high voltage DC technologies. This combination of factors makes it very important to develop simulation analysis tools to understand and address grid stability impacts in a planning and design stage for offshore wind power plants, and also to develop real-time controls to enhance grid stability and mitigate any instabilities that may happen during operation. So choice between transmission technology for offshore wind, whether is it high voltage AC or high voltage DC, it's mainly economic choice based on the cost. On this chart here, we, in a simple way, we explain how that cost is formed, although the initial capital cost of a DC transmission is much higher because of HVDC terminals you have to build both onshore and offshore. But if you look how the cost is growing with the distance, the AC transmission cost is growing much faster. At some point, there is even a jump in the cost here. It's because of the need of compensation that needs to be added to AC cable. So at some point in distance, those two cost curves cross each other, and that's basically break-even distance, which can be as low as 50 kilometers, but normally it's around 100 kilometers for offshore wind power plants. And for onshore plants, that distance is of course much higher, several hundreds of kilometers and so on and so forth. So there is no such a distinction as one technology is bad compared to the other, or each of them has pros and cons. So the choice of a technology, as I said, based on economics and many other factors that are specific for the location of wind power plants. In general, main benefits of high voltage DC transmission is you can achieve longer transmission distance You can use cheaper and lighter cables and use only 2 cables instead of 3. No reactive losses. Normally they have higher efficiencies, and also multi-terminal configurations are possible for fast and precise power flow controls. So here we show kind of most common subsea transmission voltages used in offshore wind power plants in Europe. For a DC, the TenneT formed a consortium actually to build a 2 gigawatt offshore wind power transmission up to 525 kilovolt DC, which is pretty outstanding achievement for this technology. So why high voltage AC technology has this limitation in a transmission distance? It's mainly because of a capacitance of a cable, which in turn is because of the armored shield that is normally around these buried XLPE cables that are used as in export line in this offshore wind power plants. So after a certain distance, the charging current in this capacitance becomes so high that it essentially consumes the whole current rating of a cable. So you cannot push no more current through this transmission. And for a high voltage, you can achieve higher power capacity, but then what you lose is essentially distance. So increase the distance, people use shunt compensation that can be at one end of a transmission or at both ends of a transmission. In some cases, actually, it can be in a triple points. You can have a shunt compensation in the middle of a transmission cable. So use of shunt compensation is essentially a measure to postpone use of a HVDC. But again, you can utilize this only until a certain distance, after which HVDC becomes a more economic solution. In this slide, we show the most common trends in a high voltage AC transmission technology for offshore wind power plants. One significant achievement during the last several years was the utilization of a 66 kilovolt array cable technology in offshore wind power plants. There are some vendors that already have commercially available equipment for this voltage, which makes which helps to reduce the levelized cost of energy for offshore wind power plants by, number one, reducing the electric losses in the array, and then allowing to use much larger wind turbines and making collector systems more reliable. And of course, there is a lot of innovations happening both on a plant level, on a substation level, in an export cable that are shown here that will allow to reduce the cost, overall cost of high voltage AC transmission. What 66 kilovolt makes it possible is to achieve more advanced and more reliable collector system designs in offshore plants. Normally, 33 kilovolts plants use the configuration IA, which is a single collector radial system. But with use of larger cables and the higher capacity cables, different type of the ring designs can be achieved, which will help significantly to increase reliability and availability of these collector systems. And of course, more futuristic designs such as, say, star collection systems or multi-collector rings can also be utilized, but these are mainly in a research stage right now. For high voltage DC transmission is the same. The 66 kilovolt AC collector system can be utilized, and the main driving factor for cost reduction is an HVDC converter platform design, combining AC substation and HVDC converter platform in one structure and making it as self-erecting as possible. Use a higher voltage export cables. So main converter technologies used for offshore wind power are voltage source converters, and then lately multi-level modular converters, MMC technology starts introduction into a market, and configurations for this HVDC transmission can be both mono or bipolar. Bipolar has a higher reliability, of course. In terms of the floating offshore wind power plant, it is not expected to have any significant impact on the electrical topology of a plant. Of course, it's going to have much longer cables because you have to accommodate for a water depth. These will be highly flexible and dynamic cables, with different shielding, so we'll probably have a different impedance. But in general, all electrical control, reliability, and the operation aspects of the floating wind power plants are pretty much the same as for fixed bottom technology. So what type of reliability challenges and stability challenges are we facing when integrating large amounts of offshore wind power into a grid? So as Gian mentioned, modern wind turbines are inverter coupled technologies. If we are using the HVDC transmission technology, it means there is also two converters between wind power plants and the actual grid. So this high density of power electronics that are trying to do different things, having different control loops operating at different speed, providing different type of services to the grid, will create new stability issues that we haven't seen in the past. So it's not like they cannot be addressed. I mean, these are all being researched, and there are techniques and controls to mitigate this. What I'm trying to say here that this shouldn't be neglected and should be studied as soon as possible in the early stages of a project to avoid surprises. One negative experience, we show here the data from Borwin 1 offshore wind power plant in Germany. They had an incident in 2014 where subsynchronous resonance took place, causing certain hardware issues, giving very bad publicity to this technology. But that issue has been addressed by the industry long ago, and this type of operation now is very reliable. And this is one example why you need to study these things well in advance. So just to explain the presence of these instabilities, we'll use this example of the bipolar HVDC transmission system. So resonances and control interactions are possible within which wind power plant offshore, between clusters of wind power plants, between individual wind power plants and the HVDC terminal. Some voltage instability are possible within HVDC link, and then also interactions of the whole HVDC transmission system with the onshore grid. There are a number of analysis tools that are used by the industry, including impedance-based stability analysis, electromagnetic transient simulations, power hardware and loop testing. And these all end up in development of adaptive controls and helping industry in developing improved grid codes. So the turbine design is standardized and has controls, off the shelf to mitigate these issues. Impedance-based stability analysis is kind of a newer tool, and NRL is doing a lot of research in this area. My colleague Shahil Shah is a world-known expert in this area. So the main advantage of a stability-based analysis tools is that, number one, it allows to avoid all intellectual property-related limitations, because in order to do valid analysis, you have to have a very detailed proprietary model of these power converters, which is not easy to get from vendors. But with a small signal, impedance-based small signal analysis, you can identify all potential resonances in instabilities at different interfaces in offshore wind power plants in the analysis stage, and either address them in a design or develop controls to mitigate them during the operation. NRL is doing a lot of power hardware in a loop testing type of research to validate these tools. We have multi-megawatt medium voltage grid simulators. We have field utility scale wind turbines on a dynamometer, as you can see on this graph, and also high fidelity instrumentation. So combination of both of all this allows us to emulate the conditions that the wind turbine will see somewhere in the middle of offshore wind power plants, and validate the controls and also validate the models that allows to identify this type of issues. One example of that is the example of the event that happened in the UK in August last year, when there was a blackout in a portion of a UK grid. This was caused by a lightning strike in a transmission system on an onshore grid that resulted in a trip-off of a large conventional power plants, and also trip-off loss of about 800 megawatt of offshore wind generation. So the Ørsted analysis showed that turbine controllers reacted incorrectly because of insufficient damping in a subsynchronous resonance frequency range that caused voltage oscillations and trip-off, as shown on this left graph. In fact, we have been able to replicate the exact same conditions using 4 megawatt wind turbine at NRL and power hardware in a loop setup with a grid simulator to demonstrate how this can happen, and then show in a control how this can be effectively damped. So I mentioned that high voltage DC transmission has a capability to utilize multi-terminal technology. So the main advantage of a multi-terminal high voltage DC is the ability to provide fully controlled power flows and inject them exactly where it's needed on an onshore grid. So this is a highly notional diagram of one case how the multi-terminal offshore HVDC can be used for many clusters of the offshore wind power plants. What is remarkable is that it can also be used as a backbone transmission that used as a regular transmission, transferring amount of conventionally generated power from one power system to another on an onshore grid. Another important factor that people don't talk much is the resiliency factor of this approach, is that the voltage source converters used in a multi-terminal high voltage DC systems can also have a black start capability. So any portion of onshore grid can be black started either from offshore wind or from a neighboring region utilizing this technology. So it is a very promising approach, and it doesn't need to be developed right away in the whole coast of the United States. Of course, it can be done in a phased and very planned approach, utilizing very like a phased and a planned approach, step by step, but having this capability in mind, in the future scenarios. So NRL is doing a lot of work in this area. We are developing tools that allow co-simulation of dynamic models of onshore grids and detailed transient model of the offshore wind power plants in both point-to-point and the multi-terminal approach, like I show in this diagram. So this is essentially a brief summary of the research that we do at NRL. I understand we're running out of time. We want to leave enough time for a Q&A session. So I think that concludes our presentations, right? I should stop sharing my screen now.
Great, thank you, Vahan. I really appreciate the presentation and the overview there. So yeah, Jason, over to you to moderate Q&A. I think obviously we just have a few minutes left. I think some of the presenters may be able to stay longer to answer. I'm certainly willing to do that, but I won't commit anyone else to do that.
Great. Well, that's exactly right. So we actually had indicated on the webinar registration that this would last an hour and 45 minutes. We got our wires crossed and thought we only had an hour and a half, but it just so happens we have bumped up pretty close to that. And so what I would propose is that we begin answering some of the questions, and we'll try to get through as many as possible as quickly as possible. So thank you, first of all, for outstanding presentations, very informative. Clearly, there's a lot going on. Impressive to see the array of work that the Department of Energy is focused on. Jocelyn, Patrick, thank you for bringing the team together and presenting today. So with that, I'm going to get right into the Q&A. I'm just going to I'm going to post the question and let whomever from DOE respond. First question, is there any room in the offshore wind discussion for micro wind under, say, 20 kilowatt production, such as remote site buoys, oil platforms, or instrumentation?
So I'll take that one. Yeah, I think we definitely see that there's a role for small wind in terms of powering infrastructure like buoys. We mentioned LiDAR buoys that we own that are currently deployed off the coast of California. Those are both powered in part by small wind turbines. We haven't talked about those on this presentation today because those are handled in a different part of our program. We have an extensive portfolio of research in distributed wind, which I'd encourage the questioner to come to our website at wind.energy.gov to learn more about.
Great, thank you. Next question. Offshore wind, solar, and tidal wave energy. Offshore wind, solar, and tidal/wave energy on a floating movable platform is essential for versatility. We have hospital ships, why not disaster power platforms? Anybody would like to handle that?
Yeah, so we've looked a little bit at the idea of integrating wind and wave in previous studies. I'm not sure we've thought about that in terms of solar. I think that the challenge basically with the idea though is in order to be cost competitive, these systems really need to be optimized for their purpose, and it's very difficult to justify sort of the expenditure for a single platform that you would be able to move around. The first turbine, deploying one turbine on a per megawatt basis costs a lot more than deploying 100.
Right. There was a question, what is the current cost of floating offshore wind energy? One of the attendees posted that, I'm not sure where the number came from, but states that floating offshore wind LCOE, or levelized cost of energy, as reported in 2020, is 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Anything additional on that you'd like to add?
Dan, do you want to take that one if you're still on?
Sure, yes. So we actually run, we use a reference plant to determine what a representative plant to determine what the costs would be for an offshore wind plant in the United States. And yeah, it's this year in the forthcoming cost of energy review, which will be published by NREL at the end of this calendar year. So yeah, it has 13.2 cents per kilowatt hour as the cost there. And really, we take a lot of data from our empirical sources that we've seen, as well as informed by several of the models that Matt Shields spoke about, Orbit and ORCA, to determine what that cost is.
Okay. Next question. When does Department of Energy envision the 20 megawatt turbine would be ready for certification and manufacturing, given that the 14 megawatt turbine is about ready now?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take this one as well. It's a great question. And the whole point behind showing that slide is to show what we're going to be investing in that next generation of turbines. So the short answer is we don't know. We don't know when that turbine will be available. As we said, 14 megawatts is the largest announced capacity of a turbine at this time. And just a few years ago, I would say back in 2014, 15, we were looking at, world-class, the largest turbines being 8 megawatts. And then a couple of years later, it went to 9.5, 10 megawatts. And then it went to GE's 12 megawatt, and now we're at 14. And that's all happened in the span of 7 years. So as turbines continue to scale, we're monitoring this, but, it could happen in the next decade, 15 years, just depending on the market and what kind of R&D the turbine OEMs are investing.
Yeah. And then there's, superconducting technologies that may increase the cap on size dramatically. So we'll see how that plays out. Do you provide training seminars on the modeling tools such as Orbit?
Hey, Jason, this is Matt. We haven't done that yet. That's a great question from the audience. We've shared Orbit with some external stakeholders, and I've gotten some feedback on it. And in this upcoming year, we'll be building some additional training and example tools. But we haven't actually hosted a webinar or a training session yet. Something we'd really like to do. If you've got need for the model, I would say reach out to me directly in the meantime, and just keep an eye out for invites in the future.
Great. Would you discuss coupling the techno-economic analysis, that is cost, with socio-economic analysis, value, that is value? Related is the emphasis on impacts and the concept of effects that consider both benefits and impacts.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think we recognize that there are significant shortcomings in basing our kind of long-term R&D strategy around minimizing costs. The advantage, of course, is that it's something that's easy for us to measure, whereas some of when you get into questions about what value does a technology provide to the electricity system or to society more generally, that opens up a whole other suite of questions, that some of which are simple to measure, like we have done a fair bit of work in the past on the emissions reduction benefits associated with the deployment of wind, both land-based and offshore, and thought a lot about ways in which we can improve wind technology from the perspective of providing economic benefit to communities and to the electricity system. But I think there's a ton of work for us left to do there, and it's something we're just really scratching the surface on. So it's a great question. We're really interested in digging more into it.
Excellent. Well, and related to that, there's a question here. Could you please discuss efforts to address impacts on the fishing community?
I think Jocelyn may have had to drop, but Jocelyn, if you're on, can you speak to what DOE is doing specifically on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on for maybe the next 60 seconds, then have to drop. So it's an opportunity for me to answer this question before I have to go. So it's a really good question. We developed, in conjunction with the Department of Interior, a strategy around addressing offshore wind that gave DOI the lead on addressing fisheries issues. And both the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and NOAA have been working with the fishing community. And there's also been work to stand up organizations like ROTA and ROSA, the organizations that are collaborations between the industry, the offshore wind industry, the fishing industry, government entities, and others to really try to figure out a path forward for addressing fisheries impacts. So DOE has done less work in this space historically, but currently we are actively kind of thinking about how we can best support, how we might be able to best support research in this area, particularly around reducing uncertainty with respect to impacts of offshore wind on fisheries, and are in dialogue with our federal partners about our potential role in that space as well.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Next question. Is the relationship between the size of offshore turbines to the distance between turbines linear? And for example, would the required distance between the theoretical 20 megawatt offshore turbines be twice the distance of 10 megawatt turbines? If not, would it be greater or less?
So I can jump in on this one, and Matt had to go, but he actually left a great answer to this in the Q&A dialogue box. Yes, that's true. That the relationship between the optimal turbine spacing is roughly linear by turbine size, but it's not on megawatt capacity, it's on rotor diameter. So we typically think of spacing within a wind farm as being 5 to 7 rotor diameters. So a turbine with a 200-meter rotor would need to be placed twice as far away from its nearest neighbor as a turbine with a 100-meter rotor, all else being equal. But the site-specific layout is going to depend on a lot of other factors, like what the wind resource looks like, how expensive it is to install the cables that connect the turbines together into the grid, and things like that.
Great, thank you. Does the Wind Energy Technology Office intend on capitalizing the vast amount of learning from Europe to help propel U.S. development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of we could do a whole webinar just on, in fact, we have on just on this issue. There's a lot of collaboration that we're doing with our European partners, particularly through the International Energy Agency. You know, for example, I participate in a group that is focused on sharing lessons learned about the cost of energy and exploring how technology trends differ by country and why that might be the case. Jocelyn leads an effort that she mentioned briefly in her remarks that's focused on kind of developing a synthesis of what's understood about the impacts of offshore wind on the environment with a number of European partners. And Jan, I don't know if you want to speak to a similar work that we have underway on the grid integration side.
Yeah, and I participated actively in the IEA Task 25 that specifically address the integration of wind into the system. So we have regular meetings, and recent topics includes how Europeans do their transmission planning, and how what the latest grid the Global Power System Transformation Consortium going to work with IEA Task 25 to address those problems for ISOs around the globe. So yes, we have active engagement with them.
And I suppose related to that is this next question: is DOE tracking developments in international standards and codes for offshore fixed and floating wind, for instance, IEC 61403-2?
Sure, I'll take that one.
Yep. Go ahead, Dan.
No, it's a great question. So we fund NREL to participate in standards development and kind of review international standards. Currently, AWEA, which is American Wind Energy Association, is kind of leading this effort, and we certainly take part in these meetings and try and bring all of the latest data that we're gathering in the field to inform these discussions. So yes.
Anything else? Any other responses to that one?
Yeah, just to build out like one example would be NREL is working, led by Walt Musial, is working on an effort with BOEM and with standards, bringing standards from Europe around electrical safety in offshore wind to the United States, and figuring out how to translate those for the U.S. electricity system.
Okay. I'm glad someone asked this next question, because it's a topic near and dear to my heart. What is the role for integrated transmission planning in the U.S. as opposed to individual radial connection to individual wind farms? It doesn't seem that individual developers will be able to develop high voltage DC backbones on their own, for example. How can research, markets, et cetera, encourage these developments?
I'll try to answer that. That is a great question. If you listened to the Tuesday's FERC conference, it's a lot of discussions around that topic. So consensus is for the first tranche of offshore project, they probably are closer to the shore with still available interconnection point, having just the one HVAC generation tie line. That will be the easiest and cheapest, the fastest approach. But in the future, future offshore wind plant will be further away from the shore and fighting for very scarcer interconnection points. Probably a organized transmission grid could be an option, but this has to be some study to support that approach. And for inter-regional transmission itself, it's not hard to do transmission, but to get all parties to work, that's a very difficult task. And it's not just technical solutions, but there are also a lot of issues with policies, and FERC probably have to do a more important role in that area.
Thank you. There's a couple, 2 or 3 questions here that relate to intermittency of weather-based generation, and then and the need for storage and other ancillary technologies that might be able to help address that issue, such as hydrogen production. So I'm sort of squeezing a few questions together there. So can you speak a little bit about storage and perhaps specifically hydrogen as it relates to offshore wind development?
Jen, do you want to start, and then I'll fill in on the H2 stuff?
Sure. Yeah, we have funded project in the past looking into how wind and storage could work together. We definitely can see some value of being able to for storage to play an important role to smooth the variability and to be more predictable and dispatchable for the combined wind and storage together. Patrick has funded a project to include hydrogen in this space, and I'll let him to continue on that.
Yeah, so we're working with the Hydrogen and Fuel Cells Technologies Office within DOE to explore that question right now. NREL is working on looking at sort of the most promising different technology configurations for integrating offshore wind and storage, so that we can figure out what an R&D agenda around enabling those would be. So looking at, for example, things like, do you put the electrolysis, do you put the electrolyzers out at sea with the wind farm, or do you put them back on shore? Are there opportunities, for example, to store the hydrogen at sea, and what potential does that unlock? So questions like that we're currently addressing in the project that we're funding with our sister office, the Hydrogen Fuel Cells Technologies Office, and that NREL should have a paper out sometime in the next several months on.
I'd like to add to that is we are currently funding a hybrid project, which incorporate wind technology with solar, with hydropower, and a suite of battery energy storage technologies. And that includes hydrogen and fuel cell technology to see what kind of optimal control that we can design to get the best of all technologies together.
So on that point, I think we've already decided that we're going to host a webinar soon on hydrogen. I'm also part of the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance here in Oregon, and talked to Ken Dragoon about hosting a webinar that would talk about these two topics, given the activity in Europe and the obvious interest in this. So last question here. Imagine that we always have more questions than we can answer. So pushing through, I saw an interesting one here. I'm curious about projections for commercial deployments at scale along the West Coast. Could someone please speak to the current estimates of timing and volume, even if things are aspirational at this point?
Yeah, so I guess the cop-out answer here would be that the questioner's crystal ball is as good as ours. I think what's happening in California and in Oregon right now in terms of the BOEM process for leasing, we're still in fairly early stages of finalizing area identification. And I think it'll, obviously that the large commitments that we've seen for offshore wind procurement, the number of PPAs and the number of leases, a lot of that is tied to state policy targets, and those state policy targets, at least specific to offshore wind, don't exist yet on the West Coast. So it's a really good question. I don't have a great answer for it.
Well, perhaps I can put a end point to the conversation when answering that question from my own perspective, since I'm fairly active in both California and Oregon. I can tell you that in California, the Offshore Wind California organization is actively pushing and asking for a 10 gigawatt goal. And those conversations are sort of on hold, I think, more or less until the election is over, and we'll have a little more clarity in how we move forward. In Oregon, I can tell you that a recent study by Pacific Northwest National Labs has identified between 2 and 3 gigawatts of capacity along the Oregon coast with no major upgrades to the grid. Now that's the entire coast, not just the South Coast, where most folks are sort of focused today. And there are some fairly major studies. NREL is doing one some proposed studies that will assess the future of offshore wind and grid integration and what we'll be able to do here in Oregon. And of course, in Oregon, the governor's recent executive order 20-04 addresses carbon. And we hope to see over the next year some policies, for example, 100% RPS, renewable portfolio standard, that might help drive this market, as well as just continue to move society away from carbon-based energy and toward a sustainable future. So with that, unless there's any final comments from the DOE team, I want to take this opportunity to thank the whole team for stepping up today and providing an amazing set of presentations. Very informative. I hope that the folks on the call today will look more into the Wind Energy Technology Office and better understand the suite of capabilities, the budget, and how money is spent, and to help support that office and the great work they're doing to advance clean energy from the ocean. So with that, thank you all very much for attending. Please have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next POET webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.